Hello, this is Dr. James Strickler. This lecture will cover Chapter 11, The Cotton Revolution, in the United States History textbook, American Yawp. The first topic covered in this chapter is the Cotton Kingdom, which is a reference to the fact that cotton became the dominant product, not just in the southern United States, but arguably throughout the United States in the early 1800s. Prior to cotton becoming the dominant crop, rice and tobacco were the main crops raised in the southern United States. But there was a problem with this, particularly for tobacco. Tobacco was very harsh on the soil, causing frequent rotation of crops being required, and eventually the depletion of the soil, which reduced crop yields, and thus reduced the profitability of raising tobacco. So landowners were looking for some other way to make better money, and that opportunity came with the rise of cotton. In 1785, the first bales of American-produced cotton were accidentally imported by the company of Peel and Yates in England. These first 7 bales that arrived there were the beginning of a wave that eventually would make the United States the greatest cotton producer in the world. But some important developments had to happen first. In 1793, the inventor Eli Whitney came up with the cotton gin, a machine to remove the tiny seeds from cotton. Now, this was particularly important because cotton had not been terribly profitable before this because of the intense labor needed to remove the little seeds from the cotton fibers. Once there was a machine that could do this, then suddenly cotton could become profitable. But it still required a lot of hand labor to plant and harvest, thus the need for slaves. But still, there was one other development that was necessary for cotton to become truly important, and that was the discovery of a new breed of cotton in Mississippi in 1820 called Gossypium barbadense. This is also known as petite Gulf cotton. Now, what made this breed of cotton different from others was that, first of all, it grew more densely, so you could get more cotton yield from the acres that were planted. Secondly, the cotton fibers slid much more easily through Eli Whitney's cotton gin, which meant that cotton could be processed through the gin more quickly and with less labor. So, we now had a breed of cotton that could be paired with the invention of the cotton gin that could make cotton truly a profitable product, which then led many farmers to switch from raising things like tobacco to raising cotton instead. But there was one other development that was needed to truly make the distribution of cotton efficient, and that was the widespread use of steamships. In 1812, the steamship New Orleans made the long journey from Pittsburgh to New Orleans, moving south through the river systems of the Ohio Valley and then the Mississippi. Now, this is a significant development because once you have steamships that can navigate this entire course, then products can go both up and downstream. See, previously, it was only practical to send products downstream, carried by the current of the rivers. But once steam power was used, then you could have ships move both directions, and you could truly have a trading system through the nation's navigable waterways. By 5 years after the journey of the steamship New Orleans, there was regular upriver traffic going from New Orleans all the way to Pittsburgh and other locations. Steamships would also carry products thereafter across the Atlantic Ocean. So now we had a very valuable product, this new breed of cotton, and the means of distributing it around the world. But they still needed land to raise the cotton on, and another development made that much more available. As discussed in a previous chapter, in 1830 there was a great removal of Native Americans from their native lands in the southeastern United States. Well, all that land that had been formerly occupied by these Indian tribes was then up for grabs, and initially it was sold very cheap, and it was planted with cotton predominantly. Once cotton was planted on it, and it could be seen how valuable it was, then the prices rose dramatically. But initially it provided vast amounts of acreage that could be devoted to this new crop that was going to be the economic engine for the United States for decades to come. The production of southern cotton was so important that you could argue that the cotton economy didn't just dominate the South, but dominated the entire United States. The reason is that the cotton harvested in the southern fields, in addition to being shipped to places like London, as was previously mentioned, was mostly taken to northern mills. Now, we previously discussed why there were so many mills in the northeastern United States. Because of the fall line, where you could relocate these mills where they could be powered by water flowing near the coastline. And this could allow the products to then be cheaply shipped. So cotton was harvested in the southern fields, shipped by steamboat to these northern mills where it was turned into cloth, and that was a driving force behind the American economy during this time period. The cotton that was raised in the South became the primary export for the United States of America. By the year 1835, 55% of everything that was exported from the United States elsewhere in the world to make money was cotton that was raised in the southern United States. But despite inventions like the cotton gin and the steamboat, there was still a lot of intense manual labor that was needed by hand to raise and produce cotton. And this was done primarily through the use of slaves. So you can see in two maps on this slide that cotton production was not everywhere throughout the South, but in just certain areas where the soil was particularly suited for the raising of cotton. This is then where slaves were brought. So the map on the left shows where cotton was produced primarily. The map on the right shows where slave populations were most dense. And they match up nearly perfectly, with a few exceptions, such as the coastal areas of South Carolina, where other products like rice and indigo were still raised with slave help, and in Virginia where tobacco was still raised. But throughout much of the South, the placement of slave populations almost identically matches up with where cotton was primarily raised. This then led to this area being described as the Black Belt of the South, where most of the black population was found. And we can see, even now, over 100, 150, almost 200 years later from the time period that I'm talking about, that this is still where populations of African descent are concentrated in the southern United States. Well, the use of slave labor to raise cotton then led to the creation of slave culture throughout the southern United States. And when I say slave culture, I don't just mean among the slaves themselves, but it led to a certain culture among the white population too. Throughout the South, the raising of cotton and other agricultural products were the primary economic engine. And slave labor was used for this agricultural society, which meant that most of the communities were rural. There weren't nearly as many big cities in the South as there were in the northeastern part of the United States. The population was more spread out in the countryside, and their business wasn't factories, but raising agricultural products through the help of slave labor. This is how Southern society was primarily organized during this time period. But saying that the Southern society was organized around agricultural production and slave labor can be misleading if you don't realize that there was really a two-class system in the South. There were subsistence farmers, relatively poor white farmers that worked the land themselves to provide what was necessary for their family, with a little bit of excess that they could use to sell to buy other necessities of life. And then the elite plantation owners who were rich and had vast estates on which they sometimes worked hundreds of slaves. Now you can see in the chart on this slide that the difference in this class system was dramatic, that over 3/4 of Southern whites did not hold slaves. There's sometimes a myth that everybody in the South had slaves. I should say all the free people in the South had slaves. This was not true. Most did not. And even among the less than a quarter of the population who did have slaves, the majority of them had very few slaves. Sometimes as few as one, no more than 9. Those who had 10 or more slaves were only less than 7% of the population in the South. So this idea that we have of these vast plantations with hundreds of slaves on them is the unusual situation in the South, not what was commonly done by most of the Southern whites. Most Southern whites were not slaveholders. Now, despite Southern society being primarily agrarian and rural, there obviously were some urban centers, such as, for example, New Orleans. And this was because of trade. In order to get that cotton out to the world, to be sold to them, to make money for the Southern planters, you had to ship it from somewhere. There had to be ports where it would move out to the world. And these ports became rich and important and sophisticated. People that lived in these areas tried to adopt customs and styles from elsewhere in the world. So yes, there were these metropolitan areas that tried to be more sophisticated than the people in the countryside in the South too. They were just generally smaller and few of them than elsewhere in the United States. Now, I've already mentioned that there were many slaves being used in the South for the raising of these agricultural products. There were so many that by 1860, as we closed in on the time of the Civil War, that 45% of the Southern population was actually made up of slaves. This can begin to help us to understand why Southern whites were so afraid of the slaves being freed. I'll explain more about that in just a moment. But when we recognize that slaves were almost half of the population, you can see the great potential power that they would have against the white population if they ever achieved their freedom. With so many slaves around, they then could potentially develop their own cultural identity by interacting with each other. In some places where slave populations were particularly concentrated and stable, such as the coastal area of South Carolina and Georgia, they even sometimes maintained some of the language characteristics that had been brought from Africa. There's this myth that we sometimes have of slaves not being able to form family relationships, but actually forming family relationships and maintaining them through their lives was the normal way that slaves lived. 2/3 of slaves in the South during this time period lived with their families. But having said that 2/3 of them lived with their families mean that 1/3 did not. They were broken away from their families, sometimes even as little children. You could have a husband and wife and children, and then the wife be sold off to another plantation, or the husband instead. And so they lived under constant threat of their families being broken up. And sometimes this was done specifically to keep them in line. So a slave owner might have some slaves on his estate who are not behaving the way that they were supposed to, and he might break up their families as a punishment, and then he could threaten other ones with the same actions if they did not behave the way he wanted. Other times it was just done for the economic opportunity. Maybe somebody owned land, had more slaves than were needed, and so he could sell them for a profit. Whatever the reason, enough slave families that were broken up that this was a constant threat that they had to live under. There were so many slaves, and they had such an opportunity to develop their own cultural identity, that many whites were left in fear of them. For example, the founding father Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1782 about the then growing slave population. His belief that the prejudices between the races, particularly by the whites, but also shared by the blacks, because of the injuries sustained by the blacks through slavery, would cause the two races to forever be divided. And if they continue to occupy the same land, eventually the only end of it would be the extermination of one race or the other. Now, history has shown us that this turned out not to be true. But you can understand why many whites, such as Thomas Jefferson, feared that this might be true. They had these people who they treated as a separate people, and oftentimes treated, matter of fact, probably almost all the time, treated in an abusive way. They could see them at any point rising up against them. To protect themselves against this possibility, white Southerners developed what can be called a slavery ideology. Now, what is meant by this is that they had to find some way to not just protect themselves against the possibility of slave uprisings, but also to justify the practice of slavery within their own minds, so that they wouldn't look upon themselves and see themselves as evil. One aspect of this slavery ideology was to view the white slave owners as paternalistic. Now, what we mean by that is they were essentially acting as parents to the slaves. In this view, slaves were incapable of taking care of themselves if they were not given direction and purpose in their life by white masters who owned them. This is a benevolent view of slavery. In other words, a view that slavery was a good thing for the slaves themselves, that they wouldn't be able to take care of themselves if it were not for having a master over them. This was one of the beliefs that was commonly used in the South to justify the practice of slavery. Another belief that was used to justify it was the biblical curse of Ham. So in the story of the Bible, Noah took his family on his ark and survived a great flood. And the only people that could populate the world thereafter were Noah and his descendants, his sons and their wives. One of these sons was named Ham. And Ham was identified in the Bible as having done something that made Noah very angry at him. It's kind of a silly story. The way it goes is Noah got drunk once and fell down naked in his room, and Ham went in to put a blanket over him and saw his nakedness, which was considered a very awful thing for a son to do with his father. And so Ham was cursed. At least that's the tradition that is passed down. The Bible does not mention a specific curse, but traditionally, among some Christians, this curse was viewed as a blackness of skin. See, there's also this tradition that Ham married a woman from Africa who he took on the ark with him. So, what some Christians in the South did was they used this biblical story of Ham as a justification for their black slaves being part of this cursed group of humanity. And so, their slavery was just a natural consequence of their ancestry, was the belief. Now, despite using this Christian story to justify slavery, many Christian groups nonetheless felt that the slaves themselves should be brought into the Christian faith. And so there were many evangelizing missions. Christian missionaries would go among the slave population. They would teach them about Christianity and try to get them to join in as fellow Christians. This actually worked quite well. Most slaves converted to Christianity. Now, having accepted Christianity, then the slaves started forming their own branches of Christianity among themselves. A particularly prominent example of this was the creation of the African Methodist Episcopal movement. These were churches that were primarily attended by black members of the congregation who oftentimes had fellow blacks serve as their ministers, their preachers over them. But this concerns the white population because though they wanted the slaves to become Christians also, they didn't necessarily want them to know everything about Christianity. For example, one of the most prominent stories in the Bible is the story of Moses leading the children of Israel out of bondage in Egypt. Now think about how this story would read from the point of view of a slave. You had this entire chosen people in the Bible who were in slavery, and God sent a deliverer to help them overcome the slave society that they were in and march away to their freedom. This might provide inspiration for some slaves to try to do the same thing here in America. So to try to prevent the black newly made Christians from discovering these sorts of stories in Christianity, the white majority tried to control what they did or didn't know. And one of the ways they did this was by passing anti-literacy laws, laws that made it illegal for blacks to learn how to read and write. Now, the reason that this was done was so that blacks would only be aware of those things that whites told them about. So if they never told them the story of Moses from the Bible, they wouldn't know about it. Now, these concerns that were generally had became much more intense because of rebellions that we've talked about in previous chapters, such as Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia in 1831. This was one of the most vicious slave rebellions. Remember that Nat Turner's followers marched from plantation to plantation to find the whites that were there and to kill them indiscriminately, men, women, and children. They would go to one plantation, kill the whites, then march to another and kill all the whites. Now, this was particularly horrifying for the white population, that these slaves would rise up and brutally murder them. Now, despite the fears that the white population had about the potential violent uprising of the slaves, there were other sorts of interactions that happened between them. One of those most notable in history was the sexual exploitation of black women by white men in the plantation system. There was so much of this that went on that if you do DNA studies of modern African Americans, you will discover that the average African American has 1/4 of his DNA that actually comes from Europe. That's because 1/4 of his ancestors were not from Africa, but they were whites descended from Europe. And this primarily happened early in our country's history, not because of intermarriage, but because of white slaveholders sexually taking advantage of their black slave women. Now, at the same time that they were doing this, they were greatly fearful of the opposite happening, of black men having sex with the white women. And so at the same time in the South, there developed a culture of pristine sexual purity among white women. They were supposed to be set on a pedestal as perfect creatures who never did anything wrong and were very diligently protected by their husbands from encountering anything that was considered impure. Yes, there is sort of an ironic hypocrisy in this, that the men, at the same time that they were protecting the virtue of their own women, were exploiting the virtue of their black slaves. And that does it for the material in Chapter 11 of the American Yawp.